Well, good morning, everybody. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about an area that I'm very passionate about, and that's innovation. My background, I'm an electrical engineer, but I actually did my further studies in this wonderful topic called innovation theory, which is really trying to understand how technological change shapes society. And what I'm going to try to do for the next 18 minutes is actually try to take you on a journey across the last 200 years of technological innovation, the things that have actually shaped our society, and try to take you on that journey about what's going to come next. So if any of you ever decided that you wanted to study innovation theory, as I did, and after Tim's talk I could understand if you wanted to do comedy instead, but if you did decide that you wanted to study innovation theory, the first thing that you'd learn, or one of the early things you'd learn, is that time frames matter. Sometimes when things occur matters just as much as what occurs. To give you an example of this, I'm going to do a little experiment here. I'm going to do an experiment. Let's imagine it's 100 years ago. Okay, it's 100 years ago, and I give everybody in this room $1,000 or £1,000 as it would have been in that day. But I give you all £1,000 on one condition. You either invest that in a company that makes cars or a company that makes horses. Where would you invest your £1,000 100 years ago? Cars or horses? Any ideas? Horses? I'm hearing some. I heard a car. Okay, so we're a bit split there. Well, let's compare those two technologies against each other, shall we? Let's start with the horse. It's a pretty good technology. It's 100 years. It's been around for a while. You're familiar with the horse. It's got a lovely user interface. You know, it's quite friendly. It's got this wonderful autopilot feature. If you've had one too many drinks, it might even take you home. It's cross-country. It's very reliable. It generally starts every morning, except for that one morning when it doesn't start, and you're a bit sad, and you know it's probably not going to start again. But on that note, it's biodegradable. It runs off biofuels that you can grow in your back paddock. It's cross-country, it's widely available, it's affordable. It's a pretty good technology, this horse. Let's compare it to the car 100 years ago. Smelly, unreliable, doesn't start often in cold mornings. It's not that affordable. It's unfamiliar. It's got this bizarre user interface that you don't know how to do. You've got to learn it from scratch. It runs off this stuff called petrol that you have to buy from inconvenient locations called petrol stations that you might not have gone to in the first place. Moreover, there's this whole battle going on between the car sort of advocates and the horse advocates. Believe it or not, 100 years ago, that's one of the reasons why we have automobile associations like the NRMA and the RACV. That was the car lobby trying to push back against the horse lobby, who at the time was successful in creating all these rules to try to discourage car ownership, like licenses, like speed limits. The original speed limit said that the car could not go any faster than the horse. If you lived in Arizona, there was one wonderful rule which said if you were in a car and you're driving along, you see the horse coming, you have to stop the car, pull over to the side of the road, turn it off so you don't frighten that poor horse, right? And remember how hard these things could be to start up sometimes, and wait until the horse had gone past and then start the car again. So 100 years ago, if I gave you that choice, and if we just compare those two technologies, you know, which one would you have chosen? You know, maybe it would have been the horse, the company to invest in. Now, of course, what I've just done there, you know, but of course, if we'd known that if you'd invested in, say, General Motors, you probably would have done a lot better with your investment than if you'd invested in, say, General Horse Co., which, surprisingly enough, does not exist anymore. Now, why is that? Why is that? Why would the decision at that point have been so different? Well, the reason is because I looked at things in a very narrow time frame, right? I was doing a little trick there. I was just looking at the technology. But let's look at a much broader time frame. Let's look in a long scale. The horse had millions of years. If we look at its technology trajectory, the horse had 1 million years to get where the horse was going to get. You know, we had a little blip when we domesticated them, right? The utility went up, and then after that, it was pretty flat, that curve around the utility we were going to get out of the horse. Whereas at the same time, the car was very recent, but its curve was very steep. Every year, reliability, performance was improving. And so if you look at things in a broader time frame, you can realize the decision might be quite different. Looking at the shape of the curve rather than where those curves were at the moment. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is actually why timeframes matter and the reason why I want to come and talk to you today. Because if you look at things in a very long time frame, as originally a Russian economist called Kondratiev did, and then later Schumpeter and lots of other people, Chris Freeman and others, they actually recognised that again, in terms of human development, in terms of economic development, in terms of science and technology, things were not linear. Things did not actually happen in this linear fashion. What actually happened is these things called waves of innovation started to occur ever since the Industrial Revolution. They began with effectively milling and water and steam power, moved onto the railways and onto electrification, then mass production, and then information technology. And what happened at the beginning of these waves? You started off with a lot of disruption, a lot of new technologies being formed, a lot of new businesses being created. Towards the middle, these things called dominant designs emerged, and those dominant designs were things like Microsoft Windows or AC power. And then at the end of a wave, you had a global depression. And then things would start again. And Allianz did a little bit of work. It's interesting, we always do this after financial crises, never before, which is a bit of a shame, but you can actually see here, this is the S&P 500. This is a proxy for the stock exchange for the last 200 years. And you can see, unfortunately, we didn't have anything, and not surprisingly, for the first wave of innovation, but you can see the second there. Moving on to the third, which was electrification. There's a little bit of blip called World War I in the middle, down to the Great Depression, back up to the top, which was effectively the mass production wave, then down to the oil shocks. It was very wide, but not very deep. Back up ICT, you get to sort of the middle of that, which is what we call the dot-com space, where effectively the levels of growth weren't being maintained, and then right down to the global financial crisis. And I find this curve a very compelling one. Firstly, because it really says two things. One, that perhaps we are actually at a very interesting moment in time. And that moment is when we see a transition from one wave of innovation to the next. And because what happens at these waves of innovation, a lot of the assumptions, a lot of the things that we previously held true no longer hold true. Right? There's an old saying in innovation theory, success is the biggest inhibitor of innovation. When things are successful, i.e. when we're at the top of that curve, right, you're actually less likely to see a lot of changes occur. Business models are comfortable, everybody's doing well. But when you're at the bottom of that curve, yes, there's a lot of disruption, but there's actually a lot of opportunity all at the same time. And the second reason why this is really interesting is because, of course, it begs the question, what might the next wave of innovation actually be? Because if you can identify that, if you can work out what that is, then you as a person, a company, a country can actually do very well. It's the seeds you plant during these transition periods are the ones that bear amazing fruit in those waves of innovation. Now, I don't have time to go into it, and this is really what we looked at about what happened in those last waves of innovation. But the book that we wrote and a lot of research was actually that we're going to make the bold prediction, after looking at all the possible candidates, that we think the sixth wave of innovation will be this. It will be resource efficiency. Now, why do we think that? Because what happens during these waves of innovation is you get massive changes in three areas at the same time. Massive changes in markets, i.e. what's paying for the changes of waves. Massive changes in technology, which is what is enabling those changes. And massive changes in what they call institutions, the way in which technology is coupled to markets. They be laws or firm structures or business models. So why do we think resource efficiency is the next wave of innovation? Well, let's start off with the market side. And what we're seeing at the moment is almost this amazing perfect storm, let's call it. A perfect storm where on one side, we're seeing incredible demand for natural resources increasing. Here's a little bit of work that was done by the World Economic Forum, which shows that basically, if you look at the increase in annual water demand between 2005 and 2030 is expected to rise in China by 61% alone. Right? Quite phenomenal numbers. And you can see India and so on, that the numbers are the same. Now that's quite a sobering figure, 63% rise, 61% rise. But put it in this context, the current global consumption of water is 410 billion cubic meters, 410. The current amount of readily available, reliably available fresh water from this same report is 450 billion cubic meters. I.e., we are actually consuming at the moment 90% of the world's currently readily available fresh water. and yet the numbers are telling us that we're set to increase the demand by 63%, 61%. They're not going to come together. Something is going to happen. So we're seeing on one side increasing demand, the other one we're seeing increasing scarcity. Put that together with a third part of that storm, which is actually that there's huge amounts of inefficiencies in a lot of the systems that we have around the place. 40% of the food that we grow does not go from paddock to someone's mouth. 40% of the food we grow is lost in the production process. 95% of the things that we buy are waste by weight at the end of a week. 85% of the energy that your internal combustion engine consumes, for the average car, 85% of the energy in that car does not go to moving you forward. 85% of it goes into heat and noise. And then of the remaining 15%, about 9/10 of that is actually going to moving the car, not moving the person, right? Because the car is about 10 times the weight of the person. So what you do is you really put together, on one side, demand and scarcity, which of course is a great opportunity. At the same time, huge amounts of inefficiency, and that creates space for value to be created. The second major change that we see is this wonderful thing called ecosystem services. We're actually starting to price things that have never been priced before. And when I think about that, the best way of explaining is, what is the value of a tree? Right? At the moment, if you want to try to put a value on a tree, it's got two ways of valuing it. One is it's how much how much money you could get if you chopped the tree down and sold the wood, or how much money you'd get if you chopped the tree down and sold the land. Right? But there's actually all these other values of a tree. There's the value that the tree creates when it purifies the air or turns carbon dioxide into oxygen. There's the value the tree creates when it purifies water. There's the biodiversity that the tree harbours. There's the amenity value that the tree harbours when we want it for shade or want it to actually have a look at it, and like to live in a tree-griefy suburb. There's the value the tree creates when it cools down a city. There's all these different values, and what we're starting to do is attribute some sort of economic value to those particular services that the environment creates, internalising, as they say in economic speak, the externalities. And that creates more value to then be harvested. And of course, the third one is basically we're seeing at the same time these massive investments in technology. Here's a little, I talked about those waves of innovation. You can start to see, and this is where you can find little nuggets to support hypotheses. Here's for example, is the graph of the US investments in renewable energy technology following the global financial crisis. Now everything else fell off. What happened here? Well, bang, you see that little blue line. That was trebling, or more than trebling, the amount of R&D spending in energy technology. Now this is starting to get to we will go to the moon type stuff, really lifting these areas. And it's not just the US. It's actually developing economies as well. One of the largest, in fact, the largest investment in renewable energy in the world is called the 863 program out of China. And you can see in just a few short years, what's happened is the spending in renewable energy, which was very much in the developed country space, which is the dark green bar there, has now both have increased dramatically, but the developing countries are spending half as much as developed countries are as well. We're seeing this rise. So when you put those three things together, the market changes, the institutional changes, and the technology changes, what you really get is this amazing story. A story, and I guess resource efficiency was the shorthand. The actual longhand story is that maybe we're moving from one mode of operation to another. A mode where previously we've actually been harvesting resources that were plentiful and cheap, to one where we're going to be managing resources that are scarce and valuable. And in that shift is quite a fundamental shift, because it's actually, since the Industrial Revolution and even before that, we have been in that mode of harvesting. We've actually seen our economic growth tightly coupled with resource consumption. The more we grew, the more we consumed, or vice versa. The more we consumed, the more we grew. But if indeed we're moving to a new mode of operation, it'll become the more we grow and the more we separate, the more we decouple those things, the more value we create. So what does that mean for the future? How do you actually catch the next wave? Well, we identified in the book, five particular ways in which you could find rules of thumb, you might say, around how to catch the wave. And I'm just going to share them with you briefly now. The first was a fairly obvious one. It was called waste equals opportunity, right? Find waste and turn it into something else that's valuable. A company in Canada did this. It was a beer company called Storm Brewing, right? Storm Brewing They made beer, surprisingly enough, but they also worked out that they made something else as well. They made this stuff, this grain waste stuff. It was a whole lot of grain waste that they couldn't do anything with. And in fact, grain waste is awful. Animals can't consume it. Right? There's nothing much you can do with it. But they worked out there was one thing you could do with that grain waste. You can grow shiitake mushrooms on it. So now they're not just a beer company, they're a beer and shiitake mushroom company. And interestingly enough, the shiitake mushrooms changed the nature of the waste so it could suddenly be ingested by animals. So they're a beer, shiitake mushroom and animal feed company. So here was a company that actually realised that what they were doing is they were producing something they couldn't sell and they turned that into opportunity. And I mentioned already that there's lots of waste, but if you actually look around, it's not just, are we heating the air in this room that we didn't need to heat? Are the lights on that we might not need to have on? But take, for example, your car. For those of you who own a car, because you're sitting in this room, you're probably not driving it at the moment, I can imagine. And hopefully anybody who's watching this, on the internet is not driving their car at the same time as well. But interestingly enough, that's an idle asset. That's an asset that's actually sitting there not being used. And companies are finding ways to exploit that idle asset. So a company called GoGet, some of you might know, it's a car sharing company. 10 families are using a single car when they use GoGet. Right? There's all these ways of taking waste, taking something that is currently not being used or not being fully utilised and turning it into opportunity. The second rule of thumb, which was interesting, and I actually think, the first one is obvious and profound, but this one is even more profound, was basically this: sell services, not products. If you really want to decouple economic growth from resource consumption, if you want to find a way of creating value without consumption, think about the service rather than the product. To take an example, imagine I'm selling you a washing machine, right? You're the person buying it. How long would you like that washing machine to last for? Forever. 5 years. How long do I want that washing machine to last for? Well, I'd say the warranty period plus a couple of days, right? Okay. There's a misaligned incentive, right? Our incentives are not aligned in terms of the duration, the longevity of that particular product. What if we turn it around? What if instead I give you a washing machine, but I charge you 5 cents a wash? Right? I sell you the service of clean clothes rather than a washing machine. Suddenly our incentives align. We both want that thing to last for as long as possible. Right? I could start packaging detergent or water into that service. But hang on, I'll make more money if I don't even need to use detergent in my washing machine. How do I find a way of doing that? So you can see what happens as soon as you shift into services, all the incentives become around creating value without resource consumption. There's companies like Interface that's trying to sell carpet as a service. They rent this carpet, so you get the look and feel of carpet. There's a Shire in London, in Greater London, which is actually looking at how they can sell heat as a service. So you sign up a contract and they'll keep your house between 22 and 25 degrees all year round. Now, of course, they've realised that the best way of doing that is maybe not to give you heat, not to give you energy, but actually come in and make sure your roof is insulated and there's cracks under your doors and windows. It's part of the service that they deliver to be more resource efficient. In fact, do we really want energy? Does anybody want a kilojoule? Would you like a kilojoule? No, we want light, heat, and mobility, the things that energy provides. And as soon as we decouple those services from the actual, electrons, we start to find ways of becoming more resource efficient. Put those two together and you actually get a third rule of thumb, a really interesting one, which is that how do we understand how much waste is out there? Or how do we actually start charging for that washing machine service? Right? We actually start to need to know what's going on in the world. We actually need to start understanding all those resources that are sitting out there. And what you get is you get this convergence. You start to get into a mode where everything in the natural world eventually has a digital counterpart. So whether it's that microphone, whether it's the light switch on the wall, whether it's this building, whether it's me, we all start having our digital counterpart. That microphone, might have a radio frequency ID tag, a little thing going, I'm a microphone, I'm a microphone. The light switch might be the smart grid. The building might become the building management system. I already have my digital counterpart. It's called my mobile phone. It knows a lot about me. It knows where I am. It's going to very soon be my wallet and my keys. It'll be monitoring my heart rate, so it'll know whether I'm alive or dead. Hopefully it'll call the ambulance at that point. but it becomes my way of interacting with the digital world. And basically what we're shifting to is where everything in that natural world starts to have a digital counterpart. And eventually the digital world starts to come back into the natural world. Here's a thing called augmented reality, which is really showing images of the digital world overlaid on top of the natural world. And again, there's companies, there's big businesses that are all starting to work out how to take opportunities of this. Another favourite of mine is the company that's realised that asthma puffers, right? There's a service you get from an asthma puffer. It's the delivery of Ventolin. That's a pretty good service. But they realised, what happens if I put a GPS receiver in that? Then I'm going to get another service, which is where I'm delivering the Ventolin. And you can start understanding exactly where it is that you're having asthma attacks. And if you're willing to, you can share that with public health officials so that they can actually see where everybody's having asthma attacks and identify it and improve the way that they reduce asthma attacks and so on. So, and then of course creates a huge amount of loyalty. You're not going to change your asthma puffer. The puffer's no longer disposable, so it's great. You're improving resource efficiency and so on and so on. Digital natural converge. And then we found, it was interesting. We looked at those three and we looked at other ones around, how we might actually understand how resources move through the world. But finally, I guess we came up. There was interest, and there was a catch-all. There was a couple of businesses that didn't suit those earlier ones. And what we found is that there was one area that we'd forgotten to look at, and that was actually nature. If I think about those other business, those other rules of thumbs that I just talked about, if there's one way of designing it, it's actually what nature does. Nature doesn't like waste. Nature treats waste as some sort of feedstock for another process, right? Nothing we do as biological entities is one way. Everything we do can be reversed. Nature likes to consume things as close as possible. Nature runs off sunlight. Nature is incredibly efficient. We can't even start to copy the efficiency of nature in terms of some of the things it does, like converting sunlight into energy. And the final thing that we found was that actually, if in doubt, look to nature. There's a lot to be yet undiscovered around natural processes. Take, for example, a company that's actually taking shark skin, right, and copying shark skin for the bottom of boats. Now they've got a hull of a boat where if you go faster than 6 knots, all the barnacles fall off, and it just like shark skin, and it improves the efficiency of their boat by 10%. Take another architecture firm that's actually copying termite mounds in Africa to create shopping centres, right? And this shopping centre compared to the next one is 90% less energy. It takes 10% of the energy to run the shopping centre because they've copied a natural system in termite mounds. So basically, if in doubt, look to nature. So look, what does the future look like? Well, hopefully I've given you a bit of a taste on some of these ways of innovation. Indeed, if our bold prediction is correct, what we are going to see is a massive change. It's as fundamental, you might say, as the information technology wave was that means that most of us have devices in our pockets. The mass production wave, which meant the world became more coupled. We're going to see potentially a world where, yes, we are taking waste and creating value from it. You are going to see a world where yes, we're going to see, it's going to be more about services that we get. It's going to be more about access to those services than ownership of those products, which is that world of collaborative consumption that I'm now playing with my company TuShare. We're going to start to realise that actually the barrier between what is digital and what is natural will become fuzzier and fuzzier until the point becomes where really they do start to join in one place, and everything is going to be more natural and more organic. And for me, and for with two young children, 2 young boys, that is actually a very optimistic, a very exciting thing to think about. I know we're in the midst of change and we are in a period of disruption, but actually coming from that will be the seeds of a massive opportunity and massive growth. So I hope that's helped to frame things in a bit of a different way, and I thank you for your time.